The knock came just as I was slicing through the golden brown breast of the turkey, carving it into perfect, steaming cuts I'd been proud of since dawn. My family, my brother, his wife, our teenage daughter, and unfortunately, my sister-in-law, had been buzzing around the table with wine glasses and forced smiles, the usual performance of warmth. The fire crackled. The table was lit with candles my wife insisted had to match the napkins. It was one of those picture-perfect Thanksgivings people post on Instagram like their life depends on strangers clapping. Then came that knock. Not urgent, not desperate, just calm. I wiped my hands and opened the front door, still wearing my apron that said the Carvemeister. The man standing there looked like he'd just wandered off the set of a charity ad. Worn jacket, shoes splitting at the soles, beard like it had given up halfway. He didn't smell, which surprised me. No slurring either. He just said, "Any spare food, sir?" Behind me, I heard my wife's voice before I even turned. "Just give him some cash. And close it." I didn't move, didn't say anything for a second. Then I turned, looked her square in the eye, and said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "Grab another plate, Maddie." Our daughter blinked. "Huh. For our guest." My wife's face turned to stone. You'd think I'd invited in a wild animal. Her sister Karen looked delighted, the kind of sick delight that only comes when you're about to watch someone else's reputation burn and you brought marshmallows. My brother snorted into his wine. No one moved. I said, I repeated, said another place. Maddie got up. She always does. The stranger looked down like he was unsure if he'd heard right. "I don't want to intrude, sir." "You're not." I gestured in. "Come in." He stepped across the threshold, slow, like it might be a trick. It wasn't. He nodded his thanks and took off his cap, folding it in his hands. "Will," he said simply. The room had gone quiet in the most artificial way possible. You know the silence when someone drops a glass at a party and no one wants to be the first to react? It was that, stretched out over a room full of warm food and cold shoulders. If you've gotten this far, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Most people listen without hitting that button, but it keeps our team going and helps us bring more stories like this to life. My wife stood stiffly near the kitchen island, not even pretending to hide the tightness in her jaw. She was already calculating how to spin this, how to explain away the fact that her husband just seated a man who clearly hadn't shaved since summer next to the Waterford crystal. Will sat quietly. His posture was humble, but not defeated. His eyes flicked across the table, settling briefly on my wife, then moved on. That brief flick was enough. Her expression tightened, lips pressing together so hard I thought she might actually crack a molar. Karen leaned in, not even whispering. "Did you start volunteering for the Salvation Army and forget to mention it?" "Maybe I just have a sense of hospitality," I said, carving another slice, this time with more force. She laughed. "Oh, this'll be fun." Will didn't say much, just murmured thanks as Maddie poured him a glass of water. He ate slow, carefully, as if he wasn't sure if it was all real, or like someone used to being told no, but suddenly offered a full yes and not sure how to hold it. When the yams came around, he took a small scoop. Turkey, a modest slice. Gravy, none. Polite. Like he didn't want to overstep in a house where just his existence was already crossing a line. "You from around here?" my brother asked, filling the silence with something that sounded like casual interest but was really an unspoken challenge. Will smiled. "Used to be." My wife's knuckles went white around her wine glass. Just a twitch, but I saw it. Karen caught it too. She leaned in, smirking. "Something wrong with the wine, sis?" She snapped her head toward Karen and said too loudly, "No." But her eyes darted to Will. For just a second, like he was a ghost she was trying not to admit she saw. I watched her from across the table. Noticed the way she kept pushing her food around, laughing at the wrong beats, over-smiling, making little adjustments to the centerpiece that didn't need fixing. She kept shooting me these glances like I was going to fix this. Like I'd started something she couldn't control. Which, to be fair, I had. I just didn't know how out of control it would get yet. Will sat like he was afraid to shift too much in the chair, like one wrong move would break whatever fragile permission he'd been granted. He kept his shoulders low, his eyes mostly on his plate, but not in a submissive way. More like someone scanning with quiet curiosity. The way you look at a house you used to live in before it belonged to someone else. Familiarity disguised as politeness. I slid the green beans toward him. "Don't be shy. You're not on ration stamps here." He gave a small smile, almost sheepish, and nodded. "Thank you. This is really generous." My brother poured himself more wine and muttered, "Sure is something," not even bothering to hide his tone. His wife shot him a look, the kind married couples exchange when they're both thinking, Not here. Karen, meanwhile, was thriving. You could see it in how she leaned into the scene like it was reality TV, and she was finally off the bench. My wife, Elaine, was a statue. Her jawline sharp, spine straight, eyes glassy with that look she gets when she's trying not to combust in front of guests. She offered a brittle smile and asked Will, "Would you like cranberry sauce?" "No, thank you, ma'am. But I appreciate it." Ma'am. That word had weight. Old weight. Southern, almost deferential, but not quite. Something about the way he said it made her twitch. Karen picked up on it immediately. "Will, was it?" she asked, her voice sugary sweet in that way that meant nothing kind was coming next. "You said you're from around here?" He nodded. "Used to be. Long time ago. Before they built all those condos down near Green Hollow." Elaine's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Just for a beat. Then resumed. "But I saw it." So did Karen. Her eyes sparkled. "Green Hollow," Karen repeated. "Didn't you used to work near there, Elaine?" Elaine didn't answer right away. She was too busy refolding her napkin like it had personally offended her. Then, forced, "I did. A long time ago." "Small world," Karen said, sipping her wine like she was sipping secrets. Will didn't seem to notice the undercurrent. Or maybe he did, and was just better at playing dumb than anyone at that table gave him credit for. He looked at me. "This stuffing's incredible." "Family recipe," I said. "My grandmother used to." "From your mother's side? Or your father's?" Elaine interjected, too quickly. I turned to her. "What? The stuffing? It's from your mother's side, right?" Her eyes were wide. Too wide. Like she was desperate to redirect the conversation into safe territory before it drifted back to Green Hollow and whatever ghosts lived there. I stared at her for a moment longer than necessary. "Yeah. Mom's side. Delicious," Will said. "Tastes just like how I remember it." That silenced the room. Karen was the first to laugh. Soft, like a spark flicking off a live wire. "That's funny. You two have the same taste in stuffing." Elaine's voice came out tight. "It's a common recipe." "Is it?" Karen smiled, eyes cutting sideways. The whole table was in a kind of suspended animation. Everyone sensing something was wrong, but not knowing where the fault line lay. Elaine kept her eyes glued to her plate. Will, on the other hand, had started occasionally glancing at her. Not in a confrontational way, but like someone looking at an old photograph, trying to match the face with the memory. I watched him closely now. His gaze lingered just long enough to register, then moved on like nothing had happened. But I noticed how every time Elaine laughed, or tried to, he flinched slightly, almost like the sound was too familiar. Maddie, God bless her, tried to reset the mood. "So, Will, where do you usually spend the holidays?" He smiled sadly. "Anywhere with heat, usually. Sometimes a shelter. Sometimes a bus station. Once, I sat in a laundromat all night and watched reruns on mute." Karen made a small choking noise. "Cheerful." Elaine stood abruptly. "Coffee. I'll put on coffee." "You hate making coffee during dinner," I said. She didn't answer, just disappeared into the kitchen like she needed the escape more than the caffeine. Will lowered his voice, speaking more to his plate than to anyone else. "Sorry, didn't mean to kill the mood." "You didn't," I said, watching her disappear down the hall. "You're just a guest." That was when he looked up, directly at me. Then at the doorway she'd vanished through. "She's not used to surprises," he said softly. "But I am." There was something in his tone. Not accusatory. Not angry. Just personal. Karen leaned toward me and whispered, "Why is he really here?" I didn't look at her. Just picked up my fork and said, "He's hungry." That's reason enough. But even as I said it, my mind kept circling that last line of his. She's not used to surprises. But I am. No normal stranger says something like that. Not unless the person he's talking about used to matter. Or still does. Elaine came back from the kitchen with a tray of pumpkin pie slices that no one had asked for yet. "Who's ready for dessert?" she chirped, voice pitched high like she was auditioning for a commercial. It was forced cheer in a room already weighted with quiet, twitchy tension. Karen raised an eyebrow but said nothing, content to watch the unraveling continue at its own pace. "Bit early for pie, isn't it?" my brother mumbled, glancing down at his plate. He hadn't even finished his stuffing. Elaine ignored him and turned to Will, placing a slice in front of him like a peace offering she didn't want to offer. "Here you go," she said too brightly. "Still warm." Will blinked. "Thank you. Really. It's been a long time since I had a real Thanksgiving." He said it so sincerely, so softly, you could almost forget the minefield building beneath the tablecloth. Almost. Elaine's hands trembled just enough for the dessert knife to rattle on the tray. She caught it, covered with a napkin, and laughed, too loud. "I always say dessert first, right? Life's short. Karen grinned without smiling. That's not what you said last year when I brought cookies. Elaine didn't reply. She was too busy pouring coffee that nobody had asked for, refilling glasses that didn't need it, and changing the music on the Bluetooth speaker to something vaguely jazzy, mood-neutral, and boring. It was background music for hotel lobbies and forced politeness. Maddie whispered to me, "Is Mom okay?" "She's fine," I said. "Lie. Just wants the evening to go smoothly." Will nodded as if he'd heard me. "It's a lovely home," he said, glancing around. But there was something deliberate about it. His gaze lingered on the staircase, the mantelpiece, then the hallway by the guest bathroom. "You remodeled," he said casually. Elaine froze mid-pour. "What?" she asked. He gestured. "This used to be a closed wall, right? I remember there being wallpaper with little birds on it." Karen coughed. Elaine didn't miss a beat this time. "You must be mistaken. That was before we bought it." Will tilted his head. "You sure?" "Positive," she said. "You've probably seen a dozen houses like this. It's a common layout." He shrugged. "Guess so." But she didn't sit down after that. Just hovered. Topped off people's wine. Rearranged candles. Shifted the serving platters as if 2 inches would change the trajectory of the evening. Then came the question. "So," Karen said, swirling her Merlot like a bored villain. "Where are you from, Will?" Will didn't look up right away. He finished chewing. Swallowed. Then said simply, "Around here. Grew up close by." Elaine's fork halted in midair. Held there. Motionless. Karen's eyes lit up like someone had just clicked on a hidden spotlight. "Really?" she purred. "What neighborhood?" Will didn't answer right away. He wiped his mouth with his napkin. Looked at Elaine. Not confrontational, just observing. Like he was waiting to see if she'd speak first. She didn't. So he said, "Little pocket near Willow Street. Back before they tore it up to build that strip mall. The one with the frozen yogurt and the vape shop now." Elaine put her fork down. Hard. "You okay, babe?" I asked. "Fine," she snapped. "Just full." Karen said nothing, just leaned back like she was watching a bonfire ignite at a wedding reception. "That was a rough neighborhood back then." My brother offered, trying to help. "A lot of folks moved out." Will nodded slowly. "Yeah, a lot of them didn't want to. But life has a way of pushing people around." He didn't say it with bitterness. More like someone flipping through an old scrapbook with burns along the edges. Elaine stood. "I need air." "You sure?" I asked, standing up too. She waved me off. "Just a minute." She stepped outside to the porch, leaving the screen door to creak shut behind her. Through the glass, I saw her pacing. One hand on her forehead, one tucked under her elbow. Will took a sip of coffee. Said to no one in particular, "Funny thing about coming back to old places. You remember more than you expect. Smells. Sounds. Even the cracks in the sidewalk." He looked at the corner of the dining room, where the floorboard creaked if you stepped wrong. His eyes landed there like a radar, finding an old landing strip. "Even this," he added, almost under his breath, "looks different, but feels the same." Karen leaned toward me and whispered, "He's not just some guy off the street." I didn't respond, because I knew she was right. And Elaine wasn't just scared. She was haunted. After the pie plates had been scraped clean and the candles burned an inch shorter, the room settled into that post-meal haze of contentment. Or at least it tried to. Wine glasses clinked, chairs slid back, and polite conversation resumed like a script everyone knew but no longer believed in. Elaine returned from the porch quieter, her face reset into something approximating composure. Not relaxed, never that, but schooled. She had that hostess smile back on, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Karen offered to help clear, of course, which meant she stood in the kitchen doorway making quips while I stacked dishes and Maddie brought in glasses. Will rose, too, and began helping, unasked but not unwelcome. I noticed how carefully he moved, like someone used to being told to stay out of the way and still not entirely convinced he belonged here. He reached for a serving bowl on the sideboard, but paused halfway. "That's a beautiful hutch," he said casually, nodding toward the old piece in the corner. "Still got that chip on the back left leg, I see." The room stopped. Not immediately. Not with drama. Just subtly. The kind of pause where everyone notices something at the same time, but no one knows who's going to speak first. Elaine turned toward him slowly. "Excuse me." Will looked at her, blinking. "The hutch. I remember it from. Well, it looks just the same. Down to that chip." She dropped the spoon. The clatter against the ceramic echoed like gunfire. "You couldn't know that," she said, too sharply. Will shrugged, backing off just enough to not escalate. "Maybe I saw one like it. Memory plays tricks sometimes." But it was too late. Everyone had heard the tone. Not just her words, but the speed, the sharpness. Karen raised her eyebrows so high they nearly vanished into her hairline. I stepped in, clearing my throat. It's an old piece. Probably 100 like it out there. Maybe, Will said. But that curve on the drawer handles? Pretty distinct. My grandmother had one just like it. Or maybe not my grandmother, he added, glancing again at Elaine. Maybe someone else. My wife picked up the spoon and forced a smile so taut it could have been carved from porcelain. Let's not get distracted. The dishes aren't going to do themselves. Karen sauntered over, conveniently choosing that moment to notice the family photos lining the hallway wall. God, Elaine, this one's ancient, she called out, pointing to a small framed photo near the end. You look 12. Elaine's face paled before she even turned. It was a photo I barely remembered, her in a navy blue school uniform, standing beside a science fair project that looked like it had been built by someone else's smarter sibling. Her hair was tied in a high ponytail. The smile was tight even back then. Will stepped over, curious, studied it for a beat, then said, didn't know they kept that uniform style. Takes me back. Elaine's entire posture changed. She didn't speak, just stood there staring at him, lips parted slightly, like something cracked open behind her eyes. Not fear exactly. Not yet. Just the realization that whatever story she thought she'd buried, someone else might remember it too. What school did you say you went to again? I asked, Will, my voice steady. He didn't flinch. Didn't say. Karen chuckled. Well, that narrows it down. Elaine turned and walked briskly into the kitchen. Not quite fleeing, but close. I followed. Found her gripping the counter with both hands like it was the only thing keeping her upright. You all right? I asked quietly. I'm fine. You don't look fine. She exhaled through her nose, eyes fixed on the granite. He's just strange. Makes people uncomfortable. Or maybe he makes you uncomfortable. She looked at me then, and for a second, just a flash, I saw it, recognition. Not of who he was, maybe, but of what he could be. Something was unraveling behind her eyes. And for the first time all night, I realized this wasn't just awkwardness. This was something closer to fear. She turned away before I could press her, pulled the fridge open with more force than necessary, and grabbed a bottle of sparkling water she'd only ever bought to impress guests. Back in the dining room, Will was chatting with Maddie about college applications. His voice soft, steady, encouraging. Whatever you pick, make sure you own it, he told her. Don't let anyone tell you where you're supposed to be. That's how people get stuck. She smiled. That's kind of what my dad says. Will looked over at me. Smart guy then. I nodded, watching the way Elaine hovered in the doorway like a shadow. She was listening, not participating, just hovering, calculating. The tension wasn't loud. It didn't come in shouts or slammed doors. It came in glances. In the chip on a piece of furniture no one ever noticed. In the half-memory of a uniform someone else had no business recognizing. And in my wife's silence, which was suddenly deafening. Elaine refilled her wine glass again. Her fourth, maybe fifth, I'd lost count, and the pour wasn't elegant this time. It sloshed up the side, stained her French manicure, but she didn't even flinch. She downed half of it before her hand reached the stem of the next bottle, already twisting the cap before I could say a word. She was no longer pretending to host. She was reacting, managing. Karen leaned in, tried to take the bottle. Maybe switch to water. Elaine jerked it back like it was oxygen. I'm fine. She wasn't. Her face had taken on that glossy shine she always got when the inside of her skull was spinning faster than the conversation. She still smiled, still offered two loud laughs at whatever anecdote my brother told about his new grill, but her eyes kept darting back to Will, who now sat at the far end of the living room, talking with Maddie. Their voices were low, casual, but animated. She was laughing, genuinely. Her feet tucked under her, hands gesturing like she does when she's really interested. Will asked her what colleges she was considering, and when she rattled off a few, he nodded thoughtfully. That one has a strong psych program. You mentioned you liked psych, right? She blinked. How'd you know? You just remind me of someone I used to know. Smart. Curious. Always asking questions no one else thought to ask. Maddie beamed, cheeks flushed from more than just the heat. Elaine watched all of it from the kitchen doorway, wine glass pinched so tightly between her fingers I thought the stem might snap. Karen stepped beside her and whispered, Who is he? Elaine's voice was paper thin. He can't be who I think he is. That's impossible. Karen blinked. Who? Elaine's lips parted, but nothing came out. She just stared at the floor, the kind of stare that's not really looking but remembering. Like her pupils were doorways to a place she didn't want to go back to. After a long pause, she said, No one. Just a mistake from when I was young. He disappeared. Karen gave her a long look. Elaine. I said no one. She walked off before Karen could press again, but I caught enough from the doorway. I wasn't supposed to be listening, but I had been. Every man knows the sound of his wife unraveling behind a closed-mouth lie. Elaine returned to the table and took her seat across from me, knocking over a spoon on her way down. She smiled, but her mouth trembled at the corners. Sorry, Butterfingers. Karen didn't say a word. Her eyes were glued to Elaine, studying her like a lab sample. Will, meanwhile, had Maddie in full attention. He wasn't overstepping, wasn't even trying to impress. He just had that quiet way some people have, like they've been forgotten for so long that they learn how to actually listen. When she talked about her dream of studying criminal psychology, he didn't just nod. He asked follow-up questions. What got you interested in that? A show, or something you read? Elaine coughed. Loudly. Maddie glanced back. You okay? Fine, she said too quickly. Just went down the wrong way. Karen muttered. You didn't swallow anything, but no one addressed it. I watched my wife pretend to be present. She laughed when others laughed, but her eyes were always 2 steps ahead, scanning, watching, calculating. Her fingers tapped the rim of her glass like they were keeping time with a song only she could hear. That song, I suspected, was panic. I leaned toward her. You want to lie down? No. I'm here. I'm fine, and he's leaving soon. That last part slipped out like venom. You invited him in, she added, more quietly. You started this. He knocked on the door. I didn't know it would unravel you. Her eyes flared. He's not unraveling me. Then why do you look like you've seen a ghost all night? She didn't answer. Across the room, Maddie asked Will, did you ever go to college? He smiled. Once. For a semester. Life got in the way. Like what? He paused for a beat too long. Let's just say I had a rough detour. That was when Elaine stood up too quickly, the chair legs scraping across the floor like a scream. Everyone looked over. She waved a hand. Just stretching my legs. Karen followed her out of the room with slow, deliberate steps, her face unreadable. I stayed seated, but I watched every move. Elaine stopped by the hallway bathroom. Karen cornered her there. You knew him, Karen said. Not a question. Elaine's hands trembled again. She leaned against the wall. I didn't. Not really. It was the summer. I was 18. My parents didn't know. I barely knew. What happened? He left. Or disappeared. I thought. She stopped. Swallowed. I thought he died. Karen's eyes widened. Elaine. I didn't tell anyone. Ever. Karen's jaw tightened, but her voice dropped. What about your husband? Elaine shook her head. Especially not him. Behind the wall, I stood frozen in place. My breath shallow. My fists clenched. It was all unraveling now. And the part that scared me most? I had no idea how deep this went. Elaine was in the kitchen again, pretending to load the dishwasher while really just shifting the same plate back and forth like it was some kind of ritual. The clink of porcelain was too rhythmic, too mindless. She hadn't looked at me since the whole photo incident or since she'd nearly spilled her wine for the 3rd time. I waited until the guests drifted into other conversations, the room buzzing low with wine-laced small talk and that post-meal laziness that usually sets in. Except not tonight. Not in this house. Not with him sitting in our living room like a time bomb that smiled. I leaned against the counter. You want to tell me what's going on? She didn't turn. What do you mean? You've been tense since the moment he walked in. And not regular, I don't like strangers tense. You knew him. That made her pause. The plate she was pretending to wash dipped halfway into the sink, then came back up without water. She sighed. You brought a complete stranger into our home. With Maddie here. That's dangerous. He could have been anyone. Right? I said, folding my arms. Anyone. Like someone who knows the exact chip in the furniture we bought after we got married. Someone who remembers what your old school uniforms looked like. It's a coincidence. Sure. And maybe I'm Elvis. She finally looked at me, and for a second, there it was again, that flash of something behind her eyes. Not fear this time. Frustration. But underneath it, something more brittle. I don't know him, she said through clenched teeth. Let it go. No, I said calmly. I won't. That stunned her. Elaine isn't used to me pushing. I don't snap, don't raise my voice. I tend to pick my battles. But this wasn't a battle. It was a breach. I'm going to talk to him, I said. She stepped toward me. Why? Because he knows things. And I think you do too. And I'd rather hear it from someone than keep standing in this house wondering if my wife's past just sat down at our Thanksgiving table. She went quiet, and I walked out before she could stop me. Will was sitting on the couch, alone now, nursing what was left of his coffee. Maddie had gone off with her uncle to look at some old photos from a trip they took to Yellowstone. Karen was busy replaying her mental highlight reel of the evening's chaos from the armchair, half listening while she scrolled her phone. I sat beside Will, not close, but not far either. He didn't flinch, just looked over with a slight nod. "Thanks again," he said. "For the meal. You didn't have to do that. You said you grew up around here?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah, for a while." "Where exactly?" He took a long sip of coffee before answering. "Places change. Streets get renamed. I remember more by landmarks than anything else. There used to be this red brick library near Harrison, and a corner store with blue awnings." "That's not far from here," I said. He nodded. "Didn't say it was." "What happened?" "You said life took a turn." He leaned back, eyes scanning the ceiling like the answer might be hidden in the plaster. "I was young. Thought I knew everything. Didn't know anything. Fell in love. Lost it. Took a bad turn. Made worse decisions. Sometimes you lose yourself for years before you realize no one's looking for you." That last part stung more than it should have. "You have any family?" I asked. "Not anymore," he said. His eyes drifted back to the photo wall. "Or if I do, they probably don't know I exist." There it was again. That soft hint. Not aggressive. Not obvious. Just deliberate. He wanted someone to hear it. Maybe not everyone, but someone. "Did you know Elaine before tonight?" I asked. He turned to look at me. Really look. Then smiled. Sad. Almost apologetic. "She's changed a lot." "That's not a yes." He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Silence stretched between us, taut and heavy. "Why tonight?" I asked. He tilted his head. "Because it's Thanksgiving, and I figured if I knocked on enough doors, someone might remember what it meant. And if they didn't, then I'd still have tried." I stared at him for a long moment. He met my gaze evenly. No guilt. No shame. Just presence. Then he looked down at his hands. "You got a good daughter. Smart kid. Kind." "Thanks," I said cautiously. "She reminds me of someone." He didn't elaborate. Just stood up and stretched. "I should be going," he said. "You've got a family to get back to." I stood too. "You sure? It's cold out." He gave me that same small smile. Colds never bothered me. I watched him walk toward the door, and suddenly I wasn't sure who the stranger in my house really was, him or the woman I married. Elaine returned just as I was setting down the last clean dessert fork. She'd reapplied her lipstick, I noticed, a fresh swipe of crimson that didn't quite cover the cracks at the corners of her mouth. Her posture was upright, rehearsed. She moved like she was back in control, like everything that had rippled through the evening had been pressed flat and tucked away. But the look in her eyes told a different story. A faint glassiness behind the mascara, a flicker of something coiled just beneath the surface. Will was back at the table, seated across from Maddie again. Karen had resumed her station near the wine, swirling her glass with the casual curiosity of a woman who knew the third act of the play was about to begin. Elaine placed a pie dish in the center and forced a smile. "I hope someone saved room." I sat down without speaking. Maddie reached for the whipped cream. Will leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes scanning the table. When he spoke, it was with that same quiet warmth that somehow cut through the room like a blade dipped in sugar. "I just want to say thank you again. This meant more than you know." No one replied right away. He glanced at Elaine. "Especially to you." She didn't look up from slicing the pie. Will continued, tone unchanged. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." That line. It didn't explode. It landed, like a dropped stone into a still pond. But the ripple was instant. Elaine's hand jerked. Her wine glass slipped from her fingers, hit the edge of the table, and shattered in a cascade of red against white linen. The stem rolled and clinked once before coming to a stop. The room froze. Karen's wine glass stopped midair. Maddie stared, fork in hand. My brother blinked, confused, eyes darting between faces like someone had missed a cue. Elaine didn't say anything, just stood there, lips parted, eyes wide. She barely whispered, "Excuse me." Then she turned and hurried down the hallway toward the bathroom. Karen waited half a beat before following, abandoning her wine mid-sip. She walked like a bloodhound who'd caught a scent. I didn't move. I couldn't. I sat there in the thick, humming silence that followed her exit, staring at the pool of Cabernet spreading across the tablecloth like a slow-blooming wound. Will, for his part, looked unbothered. He reached for a napkin and gently dabbed a few drops from the edge of his plate. In the hallway, muffled voices rose and fell. I caught bits and pieces, fragments that sharpened like broken glass. "Karen." "Elaine." "What the hell was that?" "Elaine." "I thought he was dead." "Karen, what are you talking about?" A beat. Then, quieter now. "Elaine, he was gone. I thought he died. It was just a summer. I didn't know." Karen again. "You mean that's the guy? The one you Elaine cut her off. It doesn't matter. It was years ago. I never even told. She stopped. Karen said nothing. Then I heard a soft gasp. Silence. I stood slowly, left the table without a word, and walked to the edge of the hallway. They didn't see me at first. Elaine had her back against the wall, arms crossed tight over her chest. Karen stood in front of her, arms slack at her sides, expression stunned. I stepped forward. Tell me what's going on. Elaine flinched. You heard? I heard enough. Her face crumpled. It was just one summer. I didn't tell anyone because it didn't matter. I was 18. It was stupid. He was a kid, barely older than me. Then he vanished. I thought he was dead, okay. I stared at her, heart thudding in my chest. And now, her voice cracked. Now he's sitting in our dining room, talking to our daughter. Karen turned and walked past me, muttering, this family knows how to pick its holidays. Elaine looked up at me, helpless. I didn't know. I didn't know. Didn't know what, Elaine? But she just slid down the wall, cradling her head in her hands. Back in the dining room, Will took a final sip of coffee. Then he looked at the photo wall again and smiled. Elaine returned like a woman walking to her own funeral. Her face was pale, almost ashen under the soft light above the dining room. The sharp lines of her cheekbones stood out more than usual. She'd wiped away whatever mascara had started to betray her, reapplied a weak layer of foundation, but it didn't matter. The mask was cracked, and everyone could see it. She took her seat slowly, with the kind of rigid grace you only see in people who know they've lost the room but are determined to hold posture anyway. Karen sat back down too, not bothering to mask her expression. Maddie was playing with a spoon, tracing circles on her napkin, clearly feeling the weight without understanding the shape of it. Will set down his cup, smiled faintly. Everything all right? He asked Elaine gently. She didn't answer, just nodded. Once. He looked around the table. One last time. At me. At Maddie. Then back at Elaine. And then, softly, so softly it almost didn't register at first, he said, I always wondered what happened to the baby you never told me about. It was like a detonation in reverse. No explosion. Just silence. A silence so thick, it had its own sound. Like the air itself recoiled. The carving knife in my hand slipped, point first, back into the turkey with a soft, dull thud. I didn't look down. I didn't even blink. I just sat frozen, the echo of that sentence running laps in my skull, over and over, like my brain couldn't catch up with my ears. Maddie was staring at Elaine. Everyone was. Elaine's mouth opened, then closed again. No sound came out. Then finally, choked, dry. She said, I didn't know. I swear. Will didn't move. Didn't smirk. Didn't look vindicated. He just looked tired. He glanced at me, not with challenge, but with something resembling apology. Or maybe pity. I couldn't tell. I didn't care. Elaine reached for her wine glass, realized it was empty, then just let her hand fall back into her lap. Karen's eyes were wide now, unblinking. What the hell is he talking about? Elaine shook her head. I didn't know. I finally spoke. Quiet. Measured. Didn't know what. That I was pregnant, she said, barely audible. I was 18. It was a stupid summer. My parents hated him. They sent me away. I got sick. My mom told me it was just stress. Then one day it was over. They said it was a miscarriage. But I didn't even know I was pregnant until they said it wasn't a problem anymore. I didn't even know. Will closed his eyes. Exhaled. They told me you left. That you wanted nothing to do with me. That you were gone. And I believed them. I waited. I searched. Then I lost everything. Elaine covered her mouth with both hands, as if that could shove the words back in. As if silence could erase what had already been spoken. I thought you were dead, she whispered. I didn't know you were alive. I didn't even, her voice cracked. I didn't even remember your last name. Maddie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom. Elaine turned to her daughter. Her lips quivered. I didn't know. Maddie didn't speak again. She looked at me instead, searching for something, stability, clarity, someone to say this wasn't real. But I had nothing. My hands were still on the table, fingers gripping the edge of the placemat like it might anchor me to a version of reality that had just been ripped away. Karen, uncharacteristically, said nothing. Even my brother was silent now. He pushed back his chair slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might set the room on fire. Will leaned back, folding his hands gently in front of him. I didn't come here to destroy anything, he said. I just needed to know. If I'd imagined it all. If I was crazy. But I'm not. And now I know. Elaine stood suddenly. I didn't choose this. He nodded, slowly. Neither did I. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about a secret. This was about someone. A life that had existed between them. silenced, buried, forgotten by some and never known by others. I looked at my wife, this woman I'd built a life with, raised a daughter with, shared mortgages and Christmas cards and arguments about wallpaper colors with, and realized there was a whole version of her I'd never met. Not someone she became, someone she had been. And he knew her, not just biblically, but completely, intimately, as if she were a story he'd once started writing, only to have someone else tear out the ending before he ever got to finish. And now, he'd spoken it aloud, and none of us could unhear it. I didn't shout. I wish I had. It would have been easier. But instead, I just looked at her, this woman who'd just shattered our home with a single withheld truth, and asked quietly, "So it's true?" Elaine blinked, like she couldn't believe I was the one asking. Like the question itself hurt more than the answer. I leaned in, both hands flat on the table. "You were pregnant?" She nodded. Her chin trembled. "With him?" "Yes," she whispered. I looked at Will, who didn't flinch. Just sat there with the calm of a man who had burned through every version of grief already and arrived at acceptance only because there was nothing else left. I turned back to her. "When I was 18, she said, breath catching. "We met that summer before I started college. It wasn't planned. It was stupid and fast and intense." "And your parents?" "They hated him," she said, her voice cracking now. "He wasn't from a good family. They said he was trouble. They said if I didn't end it, they'd cut me off completely. I didn't listen. I thought I loved him." Will stared at the floor, motionless. Elaine went on. "Then I got sick. My mom noticed before I did. Took me to a doctor her friend knew. After that, they said it was handled. They told me I'd had a miscarriage, that it was better this way, that he'd ruined my life. And when I tried to call him, they said he'd left, that he didn't want anything to do with me." Will finally spoke, voice low. "They told me you left, that you'd moved on, that it was all a game. And when I wouldn't believe it, they put me in a clinic. Said I had delusions. Said I wasn't stable. And I wasn't, not then. Because I loved you. And it broke something in me when you disappeared." Elaine's knees gave out, and she dropped into her chair like her legs were made of wire. "I didn't know," she said, shaking. "I swear, I didn't know what they'd done to you. They sent me to my aunt's for months. I didn't even know where you were." Will nodded. "Not with forgiveness. Just with recognition. I got out years later. Cleaned up. Lived in shelters. Got a job for a while. But something kept pulling me back here. I didn't have your last name. Didn't have pictures. Just fragments. Until today, I sat down slowly, feeling the weight of it settle over me like cement. "So," I said, voice tight, "you spend all these years knowing there might be someone out there with this piece of your past, and you never told me?" Elaine wiped at her eyes. "Because I didn't want to lose you." "That's not an answer." She looked up at me, red-eyed, desperate. "Because if you knew, if you really knew, you'd see who I was. Who I am. And you'd never look at me the same way again." The silence was unbearable. Even Karen didn't speak. She looked rattled, maybe even sorry. Maddie whispered, "Mom, did you know about the baby before today?" Elaine shook her head. "I didn't. I believed them. I believed I lost it. I buried that summer so deep I stopped asking questions. And when Will vanished, it felt like maybe none of it had even happened. Like I imagined him. I stared at my wife, this stranger I shared a mortgage with, and realized I had no idea what to do with what she'd just dropped in our laps. "You should have told me," I said. "I was afraid you'd leave." I stood up. "You were right." Her mouth opened, but no words came. Will pushed back his chair quietly. "I should go." Elaine barely looked at him. "No. No, please. Not like this." He gave her a look I couldn't read. Something between compassion and finality. "I didn't come here to hurt you. I came because I needed to know I wasn't crazy. That I didn't imagine you. And now I know." He turned to me. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Everything I believed about our marriage, our foundation, was now cracked open like dry plaster. And I wasn't sure if I was looking at a mistake buried in youth, or a lie that had rotted silently in the walls of our life together for decades. Elaine reached for me once, but I stepped back. Trust doesn't shatter like glass. It rots slowly, then falls apart all at once. And now, we were standing in the debris. Will picked up his coat with that same quiet care he'd shown all night, folding it over one arm as if trying not to disturb anything more than he already had. No slamming doors. No theatrics. He didn't even glance back toward Elaine, who now stood frozen by the kitchen sink, her hands clutching a dish towel she hadn't used, tears carving uneven paths through her makeup. "I appreciate the meal," Will said, nodding toward me, "and the seat at the table." He turned to go, but I stopped him. You're not walking out into the cold again. He raised an eyebrow. There's a guest room upstairs, I said. Clean sheets. Quiet. No one's using it. Elaine inhaled sharply. Will looked at me, measuring whether this was pity or penance or something else entirely. I didn't offer an explanation. Just stepped aside. He gave a small, solemn nod. Just for the night. That's all I'm offering. We didn't shake hands. We didn't need to. The exchange had nothing to do with forgiveness or obligation. It was just what felt right. After all that had been said, after all that had been unearthed, it felt obscene to let him wander back into the dark with nothing but unfinished truths and cold pavement underfoot. Maddie stayed in the dining room, shoulders hunched forward like she was trying to fold into herself. Her untouched pie had started to crust at the edges. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared at the stained tablecloth like it held some answer to a question none of us knew how to ask. Elaine hadn't moved. I heard her finally sob once, just one broken sound, and then silence again. Later, I found her in the kitchen, sitting on the floor against the cabinet, her knees pulled up like a child. She looked at me, eyes red and swollen, and whispered, I don't know how to fix this. I said nothing, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because some things can't be fixed. Some things just are, like a storm that's already come through and left everything changed. We didn't sleep in the same room that night. I sat up on the couch, lights off, staring at the hallway where the guest room was. I didn't hear a sound from behind that door. Will hadn't come down for water. He hadn't used the bathroom. I wondered if he was even sleeping, or if he was lying there the same way I was, awake, unsheltered by time, alone in the wreckage of something no one else could see. By morning, the house was still. The sky outside had turned that dull winter gray, thick with the promise of snow. I walked into the dining room, and there it was. That extra place setting. Still there. The fork slightly askew. The wine glass rinsed, but not removed. The chair pushed back just enough to show someone had been there, and might be again. Elaine didn't come down. Maddie left a note that she was going to a friend's. Karen was already gone. And Will? He emerged from the guest room dressed in the same coat, same shoes, same tired dignity. But something in his expression had shifted. Not relief. Not anger. Something quieter. He thanked me again. Said he wouldn't stay longer than needed. I didn't try to stop him. But as he walked out the front door, I watched from the window. I watched until he was gone from sight, swallowed by the suburban stillness and the fog rolling low on the pavement. I stood there for a long time. In a house that used to feel like mine. A family that used to feel like whole. Everything on the surface had cracked. But under it, beneath the pain, the betrayal, the confusion, something else had begun. Not healing. Not yet. But truth. And truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't always knock. Sometimes it just walks in and asks for a place at the table.